Rograkh Silas Ren is one of the most homogenized decks in current day CEDH, which isn't too surprising given that it's also the fastest deck. When you're trying to go light speed, there's really only one way to get it done. When we look at the commanders, you don't really have an option to slow down. Rograkh isn't getting any better on turn 4 than he was turn 1, really no matter how you build the deck, and Silas Ren, well, Silas Ren is never getting good. This means that if you want to play a slower version of Rograkh, you need to probably just play different commanders. And when I first saw Tevesh Krom, that's exactly what I thought it was, just a slower version of Rograkh. And so I peeked through a couple of lists, saw that it still played ad nauseum, and I was pretty happy to just call it a day on that opinion. Okay, Tevesh Krom is just slow Rograkh. But as I've started to make content trying to dig into the cores of these decks, really get into the nuances of the format, I figured now is a perfect time to go back and actually revisit Tevesh Krom to see if that's what it is. Is it slow Rograkh or is it something else entirely? And so in this video, we're going to dig into the core of Rograkh, like we tend to, then dig into the core of Tevesh Krom, compare the two to see how similar they are and whether or not it is a fair statement that Tevesh Krom is just slow Rograkh, a coward's choice for a deck piloted by the fearless. To do that, I took the top 100 performing Rograkh lists from the last 6 months, ran them through my code that is basically just going to count all of these cards up for me and let me know how many players ran what, and then do a little bit of manual analysis on it, find some cool breakpoints, and throw it in Moxfield. I'm going to rinse and repeat that for Tevesh Krom, though for that one I only grabbed the top 50 performing lists as it has 55 top 16s and a little over 150 entries, and while Blue Farm may not have much of a difference between the best and worst performing lists, further research is needed on my end to know if that's true of the entire format, and so to keep things safe, I only looked at 50 Tevesh Krom, then doubled everything to get percentages to compare to Rograkh. Let's start with Rograkh. I mentioned earlier that it's one of the more solved decks in the format, and what that means is that Rograkh players agree on what goes in Rograkh more than other archetypes players agree on what goes in their respective archetype. Getting into the specific numbers here, of our 100 Rograkh players, 90 or more of them are playing 81 of the same card. When we look at our core, our 75% or more, we're up to 94 cards, all the way up to 99 if we're just going with the majority of 50 or more of those players, meaning that if you wanted to just do what a majority of Rograkh players are doing, you would actually have to cut a card rather than add a card to the list based on all of this data. For reference, the format average for 3-color decks is going to be about 65 for the 90% of players, around high 70s to low 80s when we're looking at that deck core, the 75 or more, all the way up to the low to mid 90s when we're looking at just the majority of 50% or more. Before we visually look at and dive into the core on Moxfield, let's take a look at Tevesh Krom. This deck lines up a lot more with the averages that we kind of see out of the format, with 90% of the players agreeing on 61 cards, all the way up to 79 for our core of 75, and then all the way up to 95 for the majority of players. And again, we've got a smaller sample size of Tevesh Krom, but surface level, it makes sense that we're seeing a big difference in the numbers between this and Rograkh, because as you slow a deck down, your diversity of options opens up, because it's a lot easier to go slower than it is to go faster. So let's take a look at the core of each deck and then go ahead and do a side-by-side comparison. Here we have the titular Rog and Sai. The creatures, we're keeping it pretty light. 4 red creatures that are all going to generate mana. Thassa's Oracle, obviously sort of the main win condition. Then Orcish Bowmaster, a great board clear piece, or just a way to kill players. You are on 4 wheels, so if you can get down Bowmaster and throw down a wheel, you're not going to have any creature issues for the remainder of the game. Sorceries, as big and expansive as the sorcery list looks, because a lot of decks stay under 10, it's just a lot of tutors, a lot of rituals, the sorcery version of Final Fortune, you know, your 4 wheels, the Time Twister, the Wheel of Fortune, the Wheel of Misfortune, the Windfall, couple of sort of backup win conditions in Mnemonic Betrayal and Yawgmoth's Will, and then that's actually, yeah, that's it. Instance, I know that, again, 26 is a very large number comparatively. Normally we get around 22. It's just a lot of black rituals, a couple of tutors, some counter spells, some interaction, nothing we haven't really seen before on the channel. And then Daze is sort of the one counter spell that is very unique to Rograkh, making players play tighter on their mana than they normally would, and again, just continuously looking for ways to cheat mana. Deadly Rollick coming in as well, despite being an ad nauseum deck, feeling like the 4 mana is worth it in a situation like this if you don't have to pay any real mana for it. Artifacts, again, overloaded. We're seeing things that you don't really see outside of Rograkh, like Springleaf Drum and Paradise Mantle, or not necessarily not outside of Rograkh, but not outside of Rograkh, as that is what you are getting out of having that 0 mana commander, is things to
you know, culling the weak is something to sacrifice it to, but also you get the Springleaf and the Paradise, instant Mox Amber, and then all 3 talismans coming in because you are just trying to play as quickly as possible. You're not really waiting around for someone to dockside turn 3, turn 4, and win the game. You're trying to end it even before that. And then Defense Grid and Conqueror's Fell because you don't have access to silences. Enchantments, we're trying to draw cards, we're trying to win the game with Breach, and then 23 lands. When we get down to the sideboard, that's where things sort of slow down a little bit, I guess, with Warrior's Oath just being another sorcery extra turn spell, Grim Tutor. So Grim Tutor and Mount Doom are the 2 cards that are on the lowest end of the play spectrum, so with this total being 99 cards, Mount Doom or Grim Tutor is what you would cut. Grinding Station, I've had someone tell me that for the United States, East Coast players are on Grinding Station and West Coast players really aren't. And that's not something I can verify with the data I have available to me, but if anybody has insight into that, I would be interested to hear it. Taking a look at that Tivit Krom we were talking about, going to see 10 mana worth of commanders to the 0 of Rograkh. You know, a little bit of an overlap here with Opposition Agent and Displacer Kitten coming in, and Burgi and Ragavan coming out. Sorceries we actually cut in half as Rograkh is really willing to pay a lot of mana for effects that they deem worthy, and so Beseech the Mirror, completely fine to them. Not so fine for something like Tivit Krom. It's trying to play a little bit of a longer game. Toxic Deluge obviously coming in was against one extremely lonely Wheel of Fortune. Instants cut down a little bit, but for the most part, it's going to be a very similar overlap. Dispel coming in as sort of just a big preference of the Tivit Krom players. Cutting the Pyroblast, I guess it's just something they don't really agree on. And no Deadly Rollick, because you are not going to have your commander out as often as Rograkh. Artifacts we cut down to a reasonable amount. Obviously not playing Mox Amber, Paradise Mantle, all those Rograkh things are going to come out, and also only going down to just the Talisman of Dominance. Enchantments, not a fan of Necropotence here, and then lands we can again kind of skip over. The sideboard obviously going to be a lot bigger, as there are a lot of There's just less density of cards in the core here. It's 79 cards in this core to the Rograkh one. And a lot of this stuff you can kind of see are just cards that are in Rograkh that didn't quite make it to the 75% threshold here. Even clones not super popular. There's only one sort of your own clone in the sideboard, but because you are only running 6 creatures in the main, yeah, Imposter Mech makes sense. You're going to be cloning your opponent's things 90% of the time. But the one thing I really want to focus on here is Hullbreaker Horror. So initially when I saw this, I didn't really understand why. I was like, that's 7 mana, you're playing ad nauseum, there's no way you're just jamming in a Hullbreaker Horror. What is the combo? And what I've been able to parse out is if you make infinite mana with Dockside Extortionist and Hullbreaker Horror, because you just bounce Dockside and some other permanent, then you can actually draw through your entire library with Tevesh by casting Tevesh, making the Thralls, replaying whatever card you were looping with Dockside, bouncing the Tevesh to your hand, replaying it to bounce whatever that card is, sacking the Thrall to draw a card, and then like looping through Tevesh and whatever the card was in order to just draw your entire library, which I think is really cool. I'm a big fan of Hullbreaker Horror, and it is cool to see we have infinite mana combos in nearly every color combination. So Hullbreaker Horror I think is like a very unique thing to Tevesh Krom, but that's really the only unique thing about Tevesh Krom as far as I can tell.
Now it's time to get into that side-by-side that I mentioned earlier. When we're looking at the creatures, the ones that are specific to Tevesh Krom are Displacer Kitten and Opposition Agent, and that's just kind of expected, right? Opposition Agent is going to come in these slower decks. Rograkh doesn't really give a shit what you're fetching for, but Tevesh Krom, looking to take the game a little bit longer, would like to stop players from searching their libraries, a little bit of a stacks piece, and Displacer Kitten is just a high synergy card with Tevesh. You make your Thrall, you blink Tevesh, you sack your Thrall, you blink your Tevesh, you sack your other Thrall, and you can kind of get through a good 10 to 20 cards that way, assuming that you have the mana. And on the side of Rograkh, Burgi is the specific creature difference here. Burgi, not quite a ramp card, so not really going to fit in here. Definitely more of a storm card, but I've heard Rograkh called a storm deck a lot, which I personally take issue with because it doesn't use a storm win condition. Like when you say storm, I think like Tendrils of Agony, or at the very least Aether Flux Reservoir. Brainstorm definitely doesn't fucking count because that's an Underworld Breach card. That's just in every fucking red-blue deck. We can't call that a storm win condition. But when you are trying to like wheel through your deck or wheel until you find a win condition or an extra turn spell, and the amount of like double red cards in here, specifically in the extra turn spells, really give Burgi a lot of value when you're going for this more turbo game plan that you find in Rograkh. So yeah, it makes sense to me that Burgi is going to come out when you are going for a slower list. The sorceries are where we're going to find some huge differences. Toxic Deluge being specific to Krom Tevesh makes sense. You want to board wipe in your slower deck. And on the side of Rograkh, Infernal Plunge, Last Chance, Jeska's Will, Time Twister, Wheel of Misfortune, and Yawgmoth's Will. And this is where things really start to come to me in a sense of like, I don't know that we can really fairly call Tevesh Krom slow Rogsai, because so much of what makes Rogsai is the speed, and where the speed is coming from is those 4 wheels. I hate the phrase turbo ad nause, because everybody that plays ad nauseum can turbo ad nause. Like, you can just turn one fucking ad nauseum. Anybody that plays ad nauseum can do that. Your deck isn't more specifically built around doing that, in the sense that like you're running more black rituals. Everybody runs the same black rituals, with Calling the Weak being really the only exception for some lists. And so with the wheels being so core to the identity of Rogsai, it feels weird that you can go down to 1, maybe 2, like we see in Krom Tevesh, because Windfall isn't core, and still call it the same category as Rogsai. Like, how are you going to be a slower version of the most turbo deck in existence and call yourself in the same category? This is just speed and wheels, so when you cut the speed and wheels, how can you really compare the 2 lists? But we've gotten this far, we might as well keep going. Getting into the instance, we just find a couple of, sort of dealer's choice here, with Dispel and Cyclonic Rift being specific to Tevesh Krom. Again, Cyclonic Rift just a little bit too of an expensive removal option for Rogsai that wants to stay as close to the chest as possible. And in Rogsai, we find Daze, Snap, and Deadly Rollick, 2 free spells, plus actually just 3 free spells if you want to count on Snap resolving and calling it a free spell in that manner, and then Culling the Weak and Pyroblast, not quite in the core of Tevesh Krom, but are present in a majority of the lists. Culling the Weak having that synergy with Tevesh, but if you're at Tevesh already, probably not too worried about getting that additional mana unless you like Jeweled Lotus into Tevesh, which, by the way, when we get into the artifacts, Jeweled Lotus, surprise, surprise, present in the core of Tevesh Krom, not so in Rogsai. On the side of Rogsai, we have Mox Amber, Paradise Mantle, Springleaf Drum, Conqueror's Flow, Talisman of Indulgence. And the talismans are all present in Rogsai. Tevesh Krom has a weird thing where like 1 talisman is core, 1 talisman's in majority, 1 is not present at all. But the differences here aren't as big as they might look. Mox Amber, Paradise Mantle, and Springleaf Drum are just Rograkh cards, in the same way that Displacer Kitten is a Tevesh card. And so you would never see Springleaf Drum and Paradise Mantle in Tevesh Krom, and you would never see Jeweled Lotus and Displacer Kitten in Rogsai. And then for the enchantments, there's really no difference. It's just Necropotence not quite making it to the core of Tevesh Krom, obviously being very core to Rogsai because they want to draw as many cards as possible. And so that sort of, let's get these out of here, takes us to the core of the issue.
My microphone actually ended up dying mid-recording, so I had to bring you back over to the PC to actually finish this one out, but we were going back to the question that ties everything together. Is Krom Tevesh just slow Rogsai? And I think the answer, unequivocally based on the data, is of course it fucking is! All that we are doing is taking 2 Grixis ad nauseum decks that have partner commanders, which inherently means a lack of direction in the deck building process, and we are comparing them to one another and saying, yes, this one is slower than this one. That doesn't tell you anything. That's not an inherently unique idea. Krom Tevesh is obviously derived from Rogsai. When you take all of the speed out of Rogsai, all that you're left with is Grixis good stuff, which, yes, we're going to shove into the Grixis good stuff deck. The difference between the two is that if your wheel gets countered, you can cast a 5-mana commander and pretend that that's a little bit better. You take out all the wheels, you put in some board wipes and some Displacer Kittens and some cards that cost 4 mana and make you feel like you're a better deck in the mid-game. What you should be asking is one of them better? And that is inconclusive, because Krom Tevesh is a relatively new deck. It really hasn't appeared too much before the last 6 months, and so its win rate is climbing. It's at about a 35% conversion rate to the 38% of Rogsai, but Rogsai's had longevity. It's obviously got a more complete build, players that are a little bit more dedicated to it, so I wouldn't call that 3% differential like heavily swinging in Rogsai's favor. I think the answer is that yes, Grixis ad nauseum is very good, and it doesn't really matter which direction you want to take it, 5-mana commanders or a 0-mana commander and a useless piece of shit. Either way, Grixis ad nauseum will get the job done for you.
But again, the speed is just so core to what Rogsai is that it's like, if you want to play slow Rogsai, then you don't really want to play Rogsai. You just want to play Grixis, which is cool. You just have to be honest about it.